Interactive films have existed since the 1960s, but beyond some marginal successes like the amazing animated arcade cabinet Dragon's Lair and that recent Netflix sensation Black Mirror Bandersnatch, they've largely remained a niche art form. Meanwhile, in the same time period, both the film and video game industry have exploded. Not just in terms of global earnings, but also in terms of cultural significance. Reading between the lines then, if an art form hasn't gained mainstream cultural or financial success in 60 years, is it possible that it's just not very good? While the attitude adopted by many is that if we just keep developing the technology and skills to make interactive films, eventually an amazing one will be made, my opinion is a little bit different. I think that artists need to keep making interactive films precisely because they're so bad. This video is in 3 parts. First, I'll define interactive cinema. Second, I'll examine the idea that because viewers are able to make choices while watching interactive films, that makes them more immersive. Thirdly, I'll explore a different possibility, namely that interactive cinema should be seen as its own art form, one that's characterized by a shallowness of engagement that generates what's called the alienation effect. It's this effect, I'll argue, that represents interactive cinema's greatest strength, but also its greatest weakness. If you want to skip to any of these sections, use the chapter skips below, otherwise, let's get into it. First up, let me define interactive cinema as quickly as I can. Chris Hales defines interactive cinema as a sequence of pre-recorded moving images that can be affected by the audience or a performer. This definition has a lot to do with the first interactive film, which is generally understood to be Kino Automat, a black comedy about the failings of democracy shown at the Expo 67 World's Fair in Montreal in 1967. Kino Automat was screened in a special cinema where the seats were fitted with buttons that allowed audiences to vote for what would happen next. Since 1967, there have been many works of interactive cinema, perhaps most famously in recent memory, Bandersnatch, heralded as showing how the user can be involved in the transmedia expansion of production. Bandersnatch tells the story of a disgruntled programmer attempting to adapt a book. Distinct from Kino Automat's special cinema, Bandersnatch can be viewed at home using Netflix. Viewers, or perhaps more accurately, players, choose their actions and construct different paths from options the lead character can take. Going back to Chris Hales for a second, he notes that if all the audience can do is vote to choose what happens next, then the creative potential of interactive film will have changed little. For me, however, the possibility that interactive cinema hasn't changed since the 60s isn't really a bad thing. Instead of seeing this as a shortcoming of technology or audiences, we should stop to appreciate that interactive cinema might be its own unique art form, defined by its limitations. Maybe I'm wrong. For many, the promise of films where the viewer chooses what happens next is a greater sense of immersion. Exactly what immersion means in this context is vague. As it's an idea almost as old as human history, it's perhaps worth trying to define. Zhuangzi's Dream of the Butterfly, written about 2,300 years ago, questions the barrier between dreams and reality. Meanwhile, ancient Romans, about 400 years after that, collected and displayed souvenirs, using objects to recreate the feeling of distant worlds. Trying to piece these ideas together, we can see that using technology to enter other worlds and inhabiting our dreams crops up time and time again in literature and philosophy around the world. In other words, this is something that we've thought about for a long time. However, enthusiasm for technical innovation reached a fever pitch in the 20th century West and led many to believe that the immersive experiences of these stories and practices was within reach. For instance, André Bazin wrote that cinematic innovations were working towards a total cinema, or the total and complete representation of reality, a perfect illusion of the outside world. Dziga Vertov created the idea of the kino eye, or a kind of cinema that sees for us. Marvin Minsky wrote about the possibility of telepresence, and foundational games theorist Janet Murray used the word immersion to describe the experience of being fully engrossed by games. The idea was so pervasive in the games industry. One games designer, Francois Larmé, wrote in his book on game design principles in 2001, all entertainment is striving for a suspension of disbelief, so that the audience member's mind forgets that it is being subjected to entertainment and instead accepts what it perceives as reality. For game scholar and tabletop games maker Gordon Kaleha, the suspension of disbelief is best achieved by giving audiences the ability to make choices. By comparison, he argues, when we read books or watch traditional films, we have no way of altering the course of events, no way of exerting agency. These media have no way of reacting to our presence, no matter how strongly we identify with them. Interactive filmmaker David Cage, the mind behind Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls, exemplifies this attitude when he says,
"But in a play, a novel, or a film, the writer makes all the decisions in advance for the characters, and as the audience, we can only watch passively the consequences of his decisions."
So, interactivity rules, passive media drools, right? Media in which I can take action is more immersive and therefore better. No, not on my watch. You see, the fundamental issue is that the kind of immersive experience mentioned above sounds like what Kaleha called immersion as transportation. This is where media is said to completely spirit away the user to another world. This is distinct from what he calls immersion as absorption, which is when a game just keeps players occupied with its mechanics and design. Going back to Bandersnatch, although we are given choices as a viewer, our choices are extremely limited. While there are several different ways for the story to play out, this is a far cry from the immersive experience of inhabiting one's own dreams. Bandersnatch can't hope to achieve immersion by transportation, because the world of the characters is so limited. Simultaneously, the mechanics of choosing between a few options is also limited. So, we can't become properly immersed through absorption either. The options of interactive films are typically poorly defined, and it's hard to tell what impact my decision is having on the story. Really, I'm just choosing between which pre-made story I want the narrator to tell. With all the limitations of interactive cinema, particularly the limits on immersion, you might think that I'm kind of down on the medium. But honestly, I'm not. I don't believe that the limited options available in Kino Automat or Bandersnatch, or the lack of immersion that results from them, is necessarily a bad thing. Instead, I think it's characteristic of a quality of interactive cinema. I discussed how Andre Bazin and Lara May believed the purpose of media was to convince a user that they were inhabiting a different reality. But so much more can be accomplished through media besides this. This is one of the core themes of epic theatre, a mode of performance championed by famous 20th century playwright Bertolt Brecht. In epic theatre, actors are instructed to do certain weird things to make the audience aware they're watching a play. For instance, Brecht would sometimes have his actors read the stage directions out loud, or hold up signs with instructions like clap, and then have another actor ask the audience, "Why were you clapping?" The effect this created, the distance or alienation, was intentionally created so that the viewer's emotions and what they're seeing in front of them would open up a space for thinking, reflecting, and consciously learning. Thinking about Kino Automat again, the purpose of that piece through its dark comedy was to draw attention to the potential shortcomings of democracy. By making audiences respond to decisions en masse, the audience took part in a democratic process. However, the film always ends in destruction. As such, the audience is kept in a constant state of awareness that they're engaging with technology, rather than being lulled into an experience akin to inhabiting their own dreams. As such, they're much more likely to question the nature of the decisions that they're able to make, and to think critically about them. Kino Automat doesn't just give the audience decisions, it gives an audience the chance to reflect on what it means to make decisions as part of a group. This is the kind of engagement that we can have with things like FMV games. For instance, Until Dawn. On the surface, we're asked to save a group of teenagers from a slasher movie. The constant interruptions that the user interface causes to the flow means that we're never really at risk of immersion. Instead, we can just enjoy the spectacle and dark humor that comes from seeing a cliched story play out in many familiar ways, while also pushing the game itself to see if it can keep a cohesive narrative going when we make weirder and weirder choices. Until Dawn, and interactive films like it, aren't just about the thrill of a scary movie. They're a reflection on how movies within the genre are formulaic and reliant on certain tropes and cliches. Not only do films like this engage with the genre, they do so by laying the genre bare. In conclusion then, it's logical to assume that we should feel more invested in interactive film because it allows us to exercise a certain amount of choice. However, the limited nature of choices available to us, due to the fact that interactive film has to be pre-recorded, means audiences will always be aware of the medium. This, however, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can even add to the impact of the medium itself. It's just that it might be less suited for the kinds of stories we can tell in a standard film. Interactive filmmakers shouldn't try to make films that immerse us better than standard films do, because immersion by transportation is accomplished through good storytelling, plain and simple, and it just can't be beaten. Instead, interactive filmmakers should focus on making films that consider the nature and limits of choice. But what do you think? Could an interactive film be more immersive than a traditional film? Let me know in the comments below or in the Padlet link attached.